The scorching Kentucky sun bore down mercilessly on the winding highway, its heat waves distorting the air like a mirage. James Caldwell, a wealthy 78-year-old financier, gritted his teeth as he tapped his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel of his silver Mercedes. He wasn't used to setbacks, his life had been built on control, power, and precision. But today, luck had abandoned him. A flat tire. No signal. No roadside assistance. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent decades commanding boardrooms and making billion-dollar deals, yet here he was, sweating in his tailored suit, stranded on an empty road like some hapless fool. He slammed his fist against the dashboard, muttering a curse under his breath. As he wiped the beads of sweat from his brow, something in the distance caught his eye. A solitary figure, barely more than a shadow against the glaring sun, was walking toward him. James narrowed his gaze. It was a boy, maybe 13, maybe 14, his clothes worn, his sneakers scuffed and torn at the seams. A backpack hung loosely over his shoulder, the fabric fraying as if it had endured too many years of hardship. James stiffened. What was this kid doing out here alone? Was he trouble? A runaway? A thief? The boy stopped a few feet away, hands on his hips, assessing the situation. His sharp eyes flicked from the deflated tire to James's expensive car, then up to the old man himself. Got a flat, sir? He asked, his voice steady, unshaken. James hesitated. There was something about the kid, a quiet confidence, an unusual calm. Most kids would have ignored him or asked for something in return. Yes, James finally said, exhaling. I was trying to call for help, but there's no signal. The boy cracked a small smile. Yeah, reception's awful out here. But I can fix that for you. If you're enjoying this story so far, let us know. Comment 1 if you like it, 0 if you don't, and if you have no opinion, go ahead and subscribe to RVM, Black Struggles. Before James could respond, the boy dropped his backpack and crouched beside the car, running his fingers over the damaged tire like he had done it 100 times before. My grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer, he said, glancing up. Do you have a spare? James hesitated. Something about the boy's ease, his complete lack of hesitation, his unwavering self-assurance, it unsettled him. This wasn't the kind of kid he was used to dealing with. Want more powerful stories like this? Make sure to hit the like button and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe to RVM, Black Struggles for more inspiring content. Still, he nodded toward the trunk. It's in there. The boy got to work, retrieving the tools with an efficiency that impressed James. There was no arrogance, no unnecessary chatter, just pure focus. His hands, though young, moved with skill and purpose, tightening bolts, securing the jack, adjusting the spare with precision. James found himself watching, a strange feeling creeping into his chest. This boy had nothing. His clothes were tattered, his shoes barely holding together. And yet, he carried himself like he had everything. Within minutes, the task was done. The boy wiped his hands on his jeans, his expression unreadable. All set, he said simply, stepping back. James reached for his wallet, flipping through crisp $100 bills before pulling a few out. He held them toward the boy. Here. I really appreciate your help. The boy's eyes flicked to the money but made no move to take it. Instead, he took a step back, lifting his hand in a polite refusal. Thanks, sir, but I don't need anything. James blinked. What? No one ever turned down money. Not in his world. For the first time in years, James Caldwell was left speechless. The boy gave a small, satisfied smile, turned, and started walking away, his figure growing smaller against the backdrop of the dusty road. James sat frozen in place, money still clutched in his hand. The encounter should have meant nothing. But somehow, it did. Somehow, it changed everything. And James had no idea why. Hook for the next part. That night, alone in his massive, empty mansion, James Caldwell couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Who was he? Where did he come from? And why did his act of kindness, so simple, so unassuming, unravel something deep inside him? Tomorrow, he would find him. And when he did, the truth would shake him to his core. James Caldwell sat in the dim glow of his study, the untouched glass of bourbon in his hand growing warm. Outside, the vast Kentucky estate stretched into the night, its manicured gardens bathed in soft moonlight. Yet, for the first time in years, the luxury felt hollow. His mind kept drifting back to the boy, the quiet confidence, the way he worked without hesitation. And most of all, the way he refused the money. It didn't make sense. No one turned down money. Not the businessmen he dealt with, Not the people who came begging for investments, not the charities who sent letters pleading for donations. And yet, a kid, a poor kid, by the looks of him, had walked away from a handful of $100 bills without a second thought. James leaned forward, rubbing his temples. Why did this bother him so much? He had encountered thousands of people in his lifetime. Powerful men. Ruthless men. People who would sell their souls for a favor. But this boy. He was different. And that made him dangerous. The search begins. By sunrise, James had made a decision. He had to find the boy. Not because he owed him anything. Not because he wanted to force money into his hands. But because he needed to understand. A man like James Caldwell didn't like unanswered questions. Dressed in a crisp suit, he slid into his Mercedes, this time making sure to check his tires before driving back to the same dusty road where the encounter had happened. Nothing. The road was as empty as it had been yesterday, as if the boy had never existed. James stopped at a gas station, a rundown little place with a single rusted pump and a faded neon sign that flickered weakly in the morning light. He stepped inside, the bell on the door jingling. Behind the counter, an old man in a trucker cap barely looked up from his newspaper. James cleared his throat. "Excuse me. I'm looking for a boy. About 14. Dark skin. Wears an old backpack. Might have walked this way yesterday." The old man gave him a slow, skeptical glance. James hated asking for help, but he wasn't about to stop now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, placing it on the counter. "Ring any bells?" The old man raised an eyebrow but took the bill without hesitation. "So much for refusing money. Sounds like you're talking about Aaron Johnson," the man finally said, folding the bill neatly into his pocket. "Good kid. Always helping people out around here." James's heart quickened. "Where does he live?" The old man hesitated, then sighed. "Lives with his mom over in Harlan. 'Bout an hour west." James had never heard of Harlan. He pulled out his phone and typed the name into his GPS. A small town in the foothills of the Appalachians. He nodded. "Thanks." As he turned to leave, the old man called after him. "Hey!" James glanced back. "Why are you looking for the boy?" James hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer. Finally, he simply said, "I owe him something." The old man chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah. If it's Aaron you met, you don't owe him a damn thing. That boy's different." James already knew that. But now, he was determined to find out why. Arrival in Harlan. The drive to Harlan was long and winding, the landscape shifting from city outskirts to sprawling hills, then into the rugged charm of an old Appalachian town. It wasn't the kind of place James Caldwell ever thought he'd visit. It was small. Too small. The houses were old but not broken, humble, yet full of life. The streets were quiet, lined with mom-and-pop shops that looked like they hadn't changed in 50 years. James felt out of place immediately. He stepped out of his car, scanning the area. The people here weren't like the ones he knew in high society. They watched him carefully, suspiciously, as if they could smell the wealth on him. Ignoring the stares, he walked toward a small diner, where an older woman stood wiping down tables. He approached. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm looking for someone, Aaron Johnson." The woman paused, eyeing him up and down. Her gaze landed on his expensive watch, then back to his face. "Who's askin'?" James sighed, irritated. He wasn't used to explaining himself. But before he could answer, another voice cut through the room. "Mom, who is it?" James turned toward the voice. And there, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, was Aaron. The boy's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "You?" Aaron said, frowning. "What are you doing here?" James took a deep breath. He honestly wasn't sure. But what he did know was that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. For the first time in decades, James Caldwell was at a loss for words. He had spent his entire life negotiating with CEOs, politicians, and high-profile investors, yet standing in front of this 14-year-old boy, he had no idea what to say. Aaron Johnson stood in the doorway of the small-town diner, his expression a mix of surprise and suspicion. "You followed me here?" The accusation in the boy's voice made James feel oddly self-conscious, like he had been caught somewhere he didn't belong. And maybe he hadn't. The older woman, Aaron's mother, most likely, stepped forward, crossing her arms. "Sir," she said, voice firm. "Why are you here?" James glanced between them. He hadn't exactly thought this through. All he had known was that he had to find Aaron, to understand him, to repay him somehow. But now, standing in this small, unfamiliar diner, his carefully constructed plan unraveled. James hesitated, clearing his throat. I just wanted to thank Aaron. Properly. Aaron tilted his head, unconvinced. You already did. James let out a dry chuckle. Well, clearly, it wasn't enough. The boy's mother gave him a long, scrutinizing look, then sighed. Well, if you came all this way, at least sit down. James hesitated. Sit down? Here? The place was nothing like the elite clubs and fine dining establishments he frequented. It was old, worn, but warm, with a handful of locals sitting at the counter, casting side glances at the outsider in the expensive suit. The air smelled like fresh biscuits and frying bacon. It was a world completely foreign to him. But something in him told him to stay. So, against every instinct, he slid into a booth. Aaron and his mother sat across from him, and a waitress, a teenage girl with a ponytail and tired eyes, brought over a pot of coffee. You want something to eat? James looked at the menu, handwritten, laminated, and shockingly cheap. Just coffee. The girl poured his cup and walked away. An awkward silence settled over the table before Aaron's mother spoke. My name's Samantha Johnson, she said. You already know my son, Aaron. James nodded. I'm James Caldwell. I know who you are. James raised an eyebrow. You do? Samantha let out a short laugh. This is a small town, Mr. Caldwell. You make the news. James wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an insult. All right, Mr. Caldwell, she continued, leaning forward. You drove all the way to Harlan just to say thank you? James met her gaze. Yes. Aaron huffed. That's a long way just to say 2 words. James couldn't help but smirk. This kid was sharp. I like to repay my debts, James admitted. And I owe your son one. Aaron shook his head. You don't owe me anything. I helped you because it was the right thing to do. James exhaled, leaning back in the booth. There it was again. That simple, unshakable belief. The world James lived in didn't operate like that. Everything had a price. Every action had a motive. But Aaron didn't ask for anything. And that was precisely why James couldn't let it go. The truth about Aaron's life. As the conversation went on, James started piecing together bits of Aaron's life. His mother worked long hours, too many hours, at this diner just to keep food on the table. They didn't have much, but they made do. Aaron, despite his age, carried himself like a man twice his years. He worked odd jobs around town, helping wherever he could. He fixed things, ran errands, and, according to just about everyone in Harlan, would drop whatever he was doing to help a stranger in need. He's always been that way, Samantha admitted, ruffling her son's hair. Got a heart too big for this town. Aaron swatted her hand away, embarrassed. James frowned. What about school? I go, Aaron said. But I gotta help my mom too. James felt something twist in his gut. This boy should be playing, learning, dreaming. Not working to survive. And yet, Aaron didn't complain. Didn't act like he was missing out. He just accepted it. Something about that bothered James. You want to do this for the rest of your life? James asked suddenly. Aaron blinked. What? James gestured vaguely. Working. Fixing things. Scraping by. Aaron tilted his head. What's wrong with fixing things? Nothing, James said. But is that what you really want? The boy hesitated. For the first time, James saw doubt flicker in his expression. Samantha shot James a warning glance. Not everyone has the luxury of dreaming, Mr. Caldwell. James met her eyes. And what if they should? Samantha pursed her lips but said nothing. James could see it now. Aaron was smart. Quick. The kind of kid who could be more than just a handyman in a small town. But he didn't even know he had the option. That realization did something to James, something unexpected. He had spent years making cold calculations, investing in things that made money. But for the first time, he wanted to invest in a person. In Aaron. A decision is made. After a while, James sighed and pulled out his wallet. Samantha tensed, but he didn't pull out cash. Instead, he retrieved his business card. He placed it on the table in front of Aaron. You ever need anything, kid? James said, you call me. Aaron eyed the card like it might bite him. Why? James smirked. Because I don't think you realize how much potential you have. Aaron scoffed. I'm just a kid from a small town. No, James said, standing. You're something else entirely. Aaron didn't reply. James turned to Samantha. Thank you for letting me sit with you. Samantha nodded, still wary but not unkind. As James stepped outside, he inhaled deeply. The town of Harlan wasn't his world, but for some reason, he wasn't ready to leave it behind. He had come here for answers. Instead, he found something else entirely. And something told him this wasn't over. James Caldwell drove back toward his estate, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't focused on his destination. His mind was still in Harlan. Still in that small, warm diner, across from a 14-year-old boy who had more dignity and purpose than most of the corporate sharks James had dealt with in his lifetime. Something about Aaron Johnson bothered him, but not in a bad way. It was like the boy had planted an idea in his mind, one that James couldn't shake. This kid was different. He deserved more. And for reasons James still didn't fully understand, he wanted to be the one to give it to him. A decision is made. James arrived home to his massive, empty mansion, a place filled with everything money could buy. And absolutely nothing that mattered. He poured himself a drink and stood by the giant windows overlooking his estate. Aaron had turned down his money. That had never happened before. But what if money wasn't the answer? What if there was another way to help? James had connections, influence, and resources. He could give Aaron an opportunity no one else could. The question was, would the boy accept it? There was only one way to find out. The return to Harlan. The next morning, James was back on the road. He didn't have a plan, not really. Just a feeling in his gut. He pulled into Harlan by mid-morning, stepping into the diner once again. This time, he wasn't just a stranger. The locals eyed him with curiosity, some even nodding in recognition. Word traveled fast in a small town. Aaron was behind the counter, wiping down tables. The second he saw James, he froze. "You again?" James smirked. "Surprised?" Aaron sighed. "Figured you'd have better things to do than hang around here." James pulled out a chair and sat at the same booth as yesterday. "Turns out, I don't." Samantha appeared from the back, drying her hands on a rag. "Mr. Caldwell," she greeted, her voice cautious. "Didn't expect to see you again." James nodded. "I'm a persistent man." Aaron leaned against the counter. "All right, let's hear it. You didn't drive all this way just for coffee." James took a deep breath. "Here goes nothing. I have an offer for you," he said. Aaron crossed his arms. "I told you, I don't want your money." James shook his head. "It's not about money. It's about opportunity." Aaron frowned but said nothing. "I have connections," James continued. "I know people who can change lives. People who can get you into a good school, set you up with the right mentors, give you the tools you need to succeed." Aaron's face darkened. "You think I need saving?" James sighed. "No. I think you need options." Aaron hesitated. James leaned forward, locking eyes with the boy. He needed him to understand. "You're smart, Aaron. You have something most people don't. But if you stay here, if you keep fixing things and working odd jobs, you'll never get to see what you're truly capable of." Aaron's jaw clenched. He glanced at his mother. Samantha was silent. But James could see the war in her eyes. She knew he was right. But she also knew what accepting help meant. Aaron's resistance. Aaron shook his head. "I don't need a rich guy coming in and deciding my future for me." James exhaled. He had expected resistance, but not this much. "It's not about me deciding," James said. "It's about you having a choice." Aaron was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I'll think about it." It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no. And for now, that was enough. A dark cloud looms. As James left the diner, he noticed something strange. A black pickup truck was parked across the street, its windows tinted. Two men sat inside, watching the diner with cold, calculating eyes. James's instincts, honed from years of dealing with ruthless businessmen, immediately went on high alert. Who were they? And why were they watching Aaron's family? James made a mental note. Something told him this wasn't just about helping Aaron anymore. Something bigger was happening. And James Caldwell was about to find himself right in the middle of it. The dusty roads of Harlan had never felt threatening before, but tonight, they did. James Caldwell sat in his Mercedes outside the diner, watching the black pickup truck idling across the street. The men inside weren't just passing through, they were watching Aaron's family. And that didn't sit right with him. Years in the world of finance had sharpened James's instincts. People like him didn't just make money, they survived. They knew when they were being played, when someone was hiding something. And right now, his instincts were screaming. He took a deep breath, considering his options. He wasn't from here. He didn't belong in Harlan. And yet, he couldn't just walk away. A silent threat. Inside the diner, Aaron and his mother had no idea they were being watched. Aaron was stacking chairs, wiping down tables, going about his routine like it was just another night. But James knew better. Something was coming. He stepped out of his car, making his way toward the diner. As he did, The black truck's engine rumbled to life. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with tattoos creeping up his neck, leaned out the window. His eyes met James's. And then he smirked. James stopped in his tracks. The truck pulled away, tires crunching against gravel, disappearing down the road. That wasn't random. That was a warning. A past that won't let go. Inside, James found Samantha closing up the register. Aaron sat at the counter, absently flipping a salt shaker between his fingers. James sat down across from him. Who were those guys? Aaron frowned. What guys? The ones watching this place. Samantha's head snapped up. Her face darkened. Aaron stiffened. James saw it immediately. They knew exactly who he was talking about. But neither of them wanted to say it. Samantha sighed. It's nothing, Mr. Caldwell. James narrowed his eyes. That didn't look like nothing. Aaron's jaw clenched. It's our business. James leaned forward. Aaron, I don't think you realize. I do realize, Aaron cut in. I realize that you don't know anything about us. About how things work around here. James studied him. There was a storm behind the boy's eyes. Aaron wanted to believe his family could handle this. That it would go away if they ignored it. But James knew better. The past doesn't let go. It comes back. And sometimes, it takes everything. A debt unpaid. Samantha finally exhaled, shaking her head. It's Eddie Kincaid, she said quietly. James frowned. The name didn't mean anything to him. He's a loan shark, Samantha continued. Dangerous. Unforgiving. James's stomach turned. He knew the type. He had spent years in business watching men like that destroy lives. How much do you owe? Samantha went silent. Aaron's fists clenched. It's not your problem. James's gaze locked onto Samantha. It is if they come after you. Or your son. Samantha looked away. And that was all the answer James needed. An ultimatum. James stood. How do I find Kincaid? Aaron shot up from his seat. You don't. James's expression hardened. You think ignoring him will make him go away? Aaron's voice rose. You think money fixes everything? James didn't flinch. I think power does, he said coldly. And right now? Kincaid has it. Not you. Aaron glared at him, his fists trembling. James knew that anger. He had seen it in himself, years ago. It was the anger of a man who wanted to fight but had no weapons. Aaron might be smart, tough, capable, but he was just a kid. And Kincaid wasn't playing fair. James wasn't going to let this slide. So, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. Aaron called after him. James, don't. But James was already gone. If Harlan wanted to play dirty, he'd show them how the real game was played. A dangerous meeting. James found Eddie Kincaid at a rundown bar on the edge of town. He wasn't hard to spot. A thick-necked man with dead eyes, leaning against the bar like he owned the place. Around him, 3 men sat like shadows, watching, waiting. James walked straight up to him. You and I need to talk, he said. Kincaid glanced at him, unimpressed. That right? James slid into the seat across from him. How much does she owe? Kincaid smirked. And who the hell are you? James smiled coldly. Someone you don't want as an enemy. That got Kincaid's attention. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kincaid leaned in. Samantha's debt ain't about the money, old man. James's blood ran cold. He had expected a number. A price. But this wasn't about money. This was about control. Kincaid chuckled. See, she was supposed to pay me back months ago. But she didn't. So now? I get to decide when the debt is settled. James's grip tightened on the table. And what exactly does that mean? Kincaid's smile widened. James already knew. It meant Kincaid owned them. It meant Samantha and Aaron would never be free. Unless James did something about it. A line is crossed. James stood. You'll get your money. But after that, you leave them alone. Kincaid smirked. Yeah? And what if I don't? James leaned in. His voice was ice. Then you'll wish you had. For the first time, Kincaid's smirk faltered. James didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the bar. This wasn't just about money. This was a war. And James Caldwell didn't lose wars. James Caldwell wasn't a man who backed down. Not in business. Not in life. And definitely not when a thug like Eddie Kincaid thought he could toy with people. But as he drove back toward the diner, his gut told him one thing: this wasn't over. Kincaid was too arrogant, too powerful to let go that easily. And James had just challenged him in his own backyard. That meant a storm was coming. And Aaron Johnson was right in the middle of it. A furious boy and a dangerous mistake. The second James stepped into the diner, he knew he had made a mistake. Aaron was already there, standing in the middle of the room with his fists clenched, his whole body shaking with anger. "You went to him, didn't you?" James exhaled. "Aaron, you think you can fix everything with money?" Aaron's voice rose, raw with frustration. "You don't understand how things work here." James did understand. That was the problem. This wasn't about dollars. It was about power, control, fear. Aaron's mother, Samantha, stood behind the counter, her face pale. "Mr. Caldwell, you shouldn't have done that." James clenched his jaw. "And what should I have done? Watched as that lowlife held you hostage with debt?" Aaron's eyes burned with fury. James had never seen a kid so angry. "You don't get it," Aaron snapped. "Kincaid doesn't care about the money. You just made things worse." James frowned. "How?" Aaron took a step forward. "Because now he's got something to prove." The realization hit James like a freight train. He hadn't solved the problem. He'd escalated it. And Kincaid was going to retaliate. The first blow. The answer came 2 nights later. A fire. James was sitting in his study, drinking his usual bourbon, when his phone rang. It was Samantha. Her voice was shaking. "James, it's Aaron. He's missing." James was already moving. A race against time. By the time James reached Harlan, the streets were alive with sirens. Smoke billowed into the sky from a burning building, a small house near the edge of town. People were gathered outside, whispering, shaken. James parked haphazardly, jumping out of his car. He grabbed the nearest person, a man in a baseball cap. "What happened?" The man shook his head. "Somebody torched the Johnson house." James's blood ran cold. "Where's Aaron?" The man hesitated. "Don't know. Some folks saw him run toward the woods when the fire started." James's stomach dropped. Aaron was alone. Somewhere in the dark. And if Kincaid was behind this, he wasn't safe. A dangerous search. James didn't wait for the sheriff. He grabbed a flashlight and took off toward the tree line. His expensive shoes slipped against the damp ground, but he didn't care. All that mattered was finding that boy, Aaron. His voice cut through the trees. No answer. James kept moving, his heart pounding. This was his fault. He had provoked Kincaid. And now Aaron was paying the price. Then, a rustling in the underbrush. James spun, light sweeping through the trees. A shadow moved. Then, Aaron stumbled out. The boy was out of breath, his face smudged with soot, his t-shirt torn. But he was alive. James exhaled hard, closing the distance. "Jesus, kid." Aaron backed away. James froze. "I told you," Aaron panted. His voice was hoarse. "I told you not to get involved." James's hands curled into fists. "They set your house on fire." Aaron's breath hitched, but his face hardened. "Yeah. And now we have nothing." James took a step closer. "That's not true." Aaron laughed bitterly. "You don't get it, do you? Kincaid owns this town. You think you can walk in here and change that?" James met his eyes. "Yes." Aaron's jaw clenched. Then, a gunshot rang through the trees. Both of them ducked. Someone was out there. And they weren't alone. A deadly encounter. James grabbed Aaron by the wrist. "Run." Aaron hesitated. "But." "Run." They took off, crashing through the trees. Another shot rang out, missing them by inches. James wasn't a hero. He wasn't a cop, wasn't some action star. He was a businessman. But he knew when he was being hunted. And right now? That's exactly what was happening. They reached a clearing, panting. James turned, scanning the darkness. Silence. Then, footsteps. Someone was coming. James grabbed a fallen branch. Not much, but better than nothing. Aaron picked up a rock, his breath steady despite everything. Then a figure stepped into the moonlight. Eddie Kincaid. Behind him, 2 of his men, both armed. Kincaid took a long, slow breath. "James Caldwell." James didn't flinch. "Kincaid." The man smirked. "I should have known you wouldn't just stay out of it." James didn't blink. "You're going to regret this." Kincaid let out a low chuckle. "Am I?" Then he nodded at one of his men. "Teach them a lesson." The man raised his gun. The breaking point. James had seconds to react. Before the man could pull the trigger, Aaron moved first. The boy launched the rock at the thug's head with brutal accuracy. The man stumbled back, cursing. That was all the opening James needed. He swung the branch, hard. It cracked against Kincaid's arm. The man shouted, stumbling back. Aaron and James ran. This time, they weren't stopping. Bullets whizzed past them. But James knew one thing: if Kincaid wanted to kill them, he already would have. No. He wanted them to be afraid. to know who really controlled this town. But James Caldwell wasn't afraid. He was angry. And this wasn't over. James Caldwell had spent a lifetime making enemies. But those enemies had always been men in boardrooms, rivals in business, people who played their games with contracts, lawsuits, and stock manipulations. Eddie Kincaid was different. This wasn't about money. This was about fear. And right now, Harlan belonged to Kincaid. A town that won't help. James and Aaron stumbled back into town just as dawn began to break, their clothes torn, their bodies aching from the chase. The fire at the Johnson house had been put out, but the damage was done. The house was gone. Samantha stood by the wreckage, her arms wrapped around herself. The sheriff, an older man with a mustache that looked like it belonged in a different era, was there too, talking to her. The second he saw James and Aaron, his face hardened. "You two okay?" the sheriff asked gruffly. Aaron nodded, out of breath. They shot at us." The sheriff's jaw tensed. Then he sighed. And James knew. He had seen that look before. A look that said, "I can't do anything." James stepped forward. "You know who did this, don't you?" The sheriff wouldn't meet his eyes. "Sheriff," James said, voice dangerously low, "a child was just shot at in your town." The sheriff exhaled. "Look, Mr. Caldwell. Kincaid's got people everywhere. Judges. Lawyers. He's been running this town for years. The best thing you can do is leave. Take the boy, take his mom, and go." Aaron stiffened. "So you're not gonna do anything?" The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "We don't have proof." James let out a bitter laugh. "No proof? The house is burned to the ground. There are bullet holes in the trees where they chased us." The sheriff lowered his voice. "You don't understand. People in this town know Kincaid. He owns the land, the businesses, the jobs. If I go after him and lose, he'll take it out on all of them." James stared at him, realization sinking in. This wasn't just about Samantha's death. The whole town was trapped. And they were too afraid to fight back. Aaron brakes. Aaron turned away, his body shaking. His home was gone. The sheriff wouldn't help. And now, James, the rich outsider, was standing there, looking at this town like it was a business problem to solve. Aaron snapped. "You think you can fix everything, don't you?" he shouted, turning on James. "You think because you have money, you can just walk in here and make things better?" James froze. Aaron's voice cracked. "I don't need you to fight my battles for me." James exhaled, his patience fraying. "This isn't just about you anymore." Aaron stepped closer. "You made it worse." James opened his mouth to respond, but Aaron wasn't done. "You don't get it. People like Kincaid? They don't care about right or wrong. They don't care about playing fair. And now you pissed him off, and my mom and I are the ones paying for it." Silence hung between them. Aaron's chest was rising and falling too fast. His hands clenched into fists. James didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, he was completely lost. Aaron turned and walked away. James let him go. He wanted to fix this. He really did. But what if Aaron was right? What if James had just made things worse? A desperate plan. James stood by the burned wreckage long after Aaron had gone. Samantha finally spoke. "You should go." James glanced at her. "I'm not leaving." She sighed, exhaustion written all over her face. "You're not a bad man, Mr. Caldwell. But you don't belong here." James clenched his jaw. "That doesn't mean I can help." Samantha shook her head. "People like Kincaid? They don't fight with money. They fight with fear. And you don't know what it's like to be afraid of a man like that." James held her gaze. "You're wrong." Samantha frowned. James took a slow breath. "You think I was always rich?" Samantha studied him. James exhaled, finally saying the words he hadn't spoken in decades. "I grew up in a house just like yours," he admitted. "With a father just like Kincaid. A man who thought power meant owning people. A man who made my mother feel like she had no way out." Samantha's expression softened. James turned back to the wreckage. "I got out," he said. "And so will you." Samantha was silent for a long time. Then, finally, she nodded. James turned to her. "I need to know something." Samantha hesitated. "What?" James's voice was firm. "What does Kincaid really want?" Samantha swallowed. "It's not just the debt. He wants Aaron." James's blood ran cold. "What?" Samantha hugged herself. "Aaron's smart. He's good with his hands. Kincaid's been trying to get him to work for him for over a year. Offered him money, a way out. But Aaron turned him down." James felt sick. Kincaid didn't just want money. He wanted control. And if Aaron wouldn't come willingly, Kincaid would take him by force. The kidnapping. The next night, it happened. Aaron never came back to the diner after school. Samantha called his phone. No answer. James was in his car in seconds, searching the streets. And then, a text. From an unknown number. James opened it. "You should have stayed out of it. Now you'll learn how we do things in Harlan." Attached was a photo. Aaron, bound and gagged, sitting in the back of a truck. James's hands shook with rage. Kincaid had him. And this time, it wasn't about money. It was personal. James Caldwell wasn't a hero. He wasn't a cop. But tonight, he was going to war. The moment James Caldwell saw the photo of Aaron, bound, gagged, and shoved into the back of a truck, something inside him snapped. This wasn't about debt anymore. This wasn't about money, pride, or fixing a problem. This was war. And James had never lost a war in his life. A man with nothing to lose. James didn't call the police. He already knew they wouldn't help. He didn't call for backup. There was no one left to trust. He simply grabbed the .45 pistol he had kept locked away in his glove compartment for years, a relic from a past life he never talked about, and climbed into his car. The text message had no address. But it didn't need one. There was only one place Kincaid would take him. The old lumber mill on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down for years, but Kincaid owned it now. And tonight, James was going to take it from him. A desperate mother. Before he could leave, his phone buzzed again. Another message. "Samantha." James answered. "Where is he?" Her voice was raw, shaking. James gripped the wheel. "I know where they took him. I'm coming with you." "No." His voice was hard. "Stay put. I can't just." "Samantha," James said firmly. "If you go, they'll use you against him. You want to save your son? Let me handle this." Silence. Then, finally, a quiet sob. "Bring him back." James hung up. And then, for the first time in decades, he pressed his foot to the gas pedal, not like a businessman, but like a man on a mission. Walking into the fire, the old lumber mill stood in the moonlight like a beast of steel and rust. James killed the engine and stepped out. Silence. But he knew they were inside. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the weight of the gun at his back. It had been years since he held one. Too many years. But tonight, he was willing to do whatever it took. Taking a breath, he pushed open the rusted metal doors. Inside, shadows moved. Then, a voice. "Mr. Caldwell," Eddie Kincaid called from the dark. "Didn't expect you to come alone." James stepped forward. "Let him go." Kincaid chuckled. "Now, see. That's the problem with rich men like you. You think you get to make the rules." A light flickered on. And there, tied to a chair in the center of the room, was Aaron. His face was bruised. But his eyes? They were still burning with fire. James clenched his fists. Kincaid stepped closer. "You should have stayed in your fancy house, old man. You don't belong in Harlan." James smirked. "Funny. I was just thinking the same thing about you." Kincaid's expression darkened. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think these people are gonna stand up for you?" He gestured around the room. That's when James noticed the other men standing in the shadows. 5 of them. Armed. Kincaid leaned in. "You don't leave here alive." James exhaled. And smiled. "I wouldn't bet on that." Then, he moved. The fight for survival. James wasn't a soldier. But he was fast. Before Kincaid could react, James grabbed his gun and swung it like a hammer, cracking Kincaid across the jaw. Kincaid staggered back. Gunfire erupted. James dove behind a stack of crates as bullets slammed into wood, splintering the air. Aaron was shouting, struggling against his ropes. James moved fast. He rolled out, fired 2 quick shots. One hit a man's shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. Another lunged at him. James turned, grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the floor, and swung hard. The impact sent the thug sprawling. But there were too many. A hand grabbed James's jacket, slamming him against a wall. His gun skidded across the floor. Kincaid recovered, wiping blood from his mouth. He stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "This is how it ends," he sneered. James Caldwell never backed down from a fight. And he wasn't about to start now. Kincaid swung. James dodged, but not fast enough. The hit caught his ribs, pain exploded through his side. Another punch. James barely ducked in time. His vision blurred. He was losing. And then, Aaron's voice cut through the chaos. "Hey!" Kincaid turned. That's when Aaron, still tied to the chair, threw himself backward, sending his full weight crashing into Kincaid's legs. The thug stumbled. Just enough. James lunged. He grabbed the pipe, and swung it with everything he had. It connected with Kincaid's knee. There was a sickening crack. Kincaid collapsed. James grabbed his gun and aimed it directly between Kincaid's eyes. Silence. The remaining men froze. James's chest heaved. His hands were steady. He wasn't going to kill Kincaid. But he was going to end him. "You're done," James growled. "I have money, power, and lawyers who will bury you so deep, no one will even remember your name." Kincaid groaned in pain. James leaned closer. "You mess with Aaron or his mother again?" He pressed the barrel against Kincaid's forehead. "I will personally destroy everything you own." The room was silent. Then, the sound of sirens. James exhaled. Someone had called the cops. For once, they were coming. The aftermath. Kincaid was arrested. His men scattered. By morning, the town knew. For the first time in years, Kincaid wasn't in control anymore. And James Caldwell? He wasn't just a rich outsider anymore. He was something else. He was part of Harlan. The final choice. A week later, James stood outside the remains of Aaron's home. He had an offer. "I bought some land outside of town," he told Samantha. "Big house. Space to rebuild." Samantha's eyes filled with tears. "But Aaron?" Aaron stared at him. James sighed. "You don't have to take it. But I want you to have the choice." Aaron was quiet. Then, he took the keys. James smiled. For the first time, the boy trusted him. And for the first time in a long time, James Caldwell felt like he had done something right. The ending, a new beginning. Harlan would never be the same. Kincaid was gone. Aaron and his mother were finally free. And James? James wasn't going back to his old life. Not yet. He had a town to rebuild. And a boy to guide. Because for the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for. Life lessons from the story, applying it to today's world. At its core, this story isn't just about a rich man helping a poor kid. It's about standing up when no one else will. In today's world, fear, corruption, and control still exist. There are people like Eddie Kincaid, those who manipulate others through debt, intimidation, or power. And there are towns like Harlan, where people feel trapped, believing they have no choice but to accept injustice. But the truth is, we always have a choice. James Caldwell wasn't a hero. He was a flawed man, a businessman who had spent his life thinking money was the solution to everything. But when faced with real injustice, he learned that true power isn't in wealth, it's in showing up, in using what you have to fight for what's right. So what can we learn from this? White check mark, helping others isn't just about giving money. Sometimes, people don't need a handout. They need a chance. A choice. A voice. White check mark, courage is contagious. One act of defiance against injustice can inspire others to stand up. White check mark, power belongs to those who use it for good. Whether it's in business, community, or family, use your influence to lift others up. Injustice thrives when good people stay silent. But as James learned, when you step up, you can change everything.